He was a kind man who loved his wife more than anything else. But the same wife didn't think twice before cheating on him.
I wouldn't delude myself for a second that you were in love with me.
This broke his heart, so he designed a demonic revenge that will actually shock you.
I realize this is very unpleasant, but please let's not make this ugly.
Welcome back to Paramount Recaps. I don't have many subscribers, but your single comment is a ray of hope to motivate me. The story kicks off in 1925 China, where Dr. Walter Fane and his wife Kitty are stuck in the rain, waiting for someone to escort them to a remote village. We jump back 2 years earlier to London, where high society folks are mingling at a fancy party. Walter first spots Kitty, who's strikingly beautiful, and manages to ask her for a dance. The next day, Kitty's mother asks her about this mystery man, and Kitty learns that Walter was invited by her father. It turns out Walter's a scientist, working as the head of a government lab in Shanghai. Kitty's mom is all for it, thinking Walter's the perfect match. But Kitty isn't so thrilled. She doesn't want to marry someone she doesn't feel a spark with. Things get tense when her mom reminds her that her dad isn't going to financially support her forever. Frustrated, Kitty storms out, only to find Walter waiting for her with a box of candy. Awkward but sweet, he asks if he can join her for a walk. Back in the present, the couple finally meets the people who've come to take them to the village. Flashing back again, we see Kitty walking with Walter, and they end up in a flower shop. Kitty's not impressed with flowers, finding them pointless since they die so quickly. Out of the blue, Walter asks her to marry him. She's totally caught off guard. They barely know each other. Walter explains that he's got to head back to China soon, and if she says yes, he promises to do everything he can to make her happy. Kitty doesn't answer right away.
Surely you're not expecting me to answer this second.
Later, she overhears her mom bragging about Kitty's sister, who made a good marriage, and this nudges Kitty into agreeing to marry Walter. They move to Shanghai, and after they settle into Walter's modest apartment, he shyly asks Kitty if she needs anything before bed. When Kitty suggests he stay, Walter, feeling awkward, turns off the light out of embarrassment. Shanghai life isn't what Kitty expected. Walter is busy with work, and they have nothing in common. Bored, Kitty agrees to attend a social event hosted by Dorothy Townsend, the wife of the vice consul. At the event, Kitty meets Charlie Townsend, and unlike Walter, Charlie manages to make her laugh. It's the first time she's genuinely smiled since their wedding. Meanwhile, back in the present, the couple continues their grueling journey to the village. In a flashback, we learn that Kitty had an affair with Charlie, and one day, Walter came home early, found out. Kitty feels guilty, but she's also miserable in her marriage, having fallen hard for Charlie. She even wears a ring he gave her around her neck. One day, Kitty overhears Walter talking about a cholera outbreak in a remote village, and he plans to volunteer there. Kitty refuses to go at first, not understanding why Walter cares so much about strangers. But Walter threatens to divorce her if she doesn't come, warning that if anyone finds out about her affair with Charlie, her reputation will be ruined.
I am divorcing you for adultery.
Kitty admits she's in love with Charlie and that he promised to marry her, but Walter just laughs, calling her naive. Kitty goes to see Charlie, expecting him to stand by his promise. But Charlie backs out, not wanting to tarnish his own reputation with a scandalous divorce.
Please, we'll work this out, I promise.
Defeated, Kitty agrees to accompany Walter on his dangerous journey to the village. Along the way, they see a funeral procession, and when they finally arrive, their new home is a rundown shack. Walter warns Kitty not to touch anything, as the previous occupants died of cholera. Kitty is left to fend for herself while Walter immerses himself in his work. Waddington, a neighbor and deputy commissioner, pays Kitty a visit, sharing that cholera isn't the only problem they face. Nationalists are also when Walter returns, he reveals his main reason for coming, to research the disease. He plans to visit the town the next day, even though neither he nor Kitty has been vaccinated. Walter brushes off Kitty's concerns, saying cholera spares no one, leaving her terrified. The next morning, Waddington posts a guard outside their home to protect them from nationalist attacks. But to Kitty, it feels like she's trapped. Walter leaves for town, where he faces angry locals who don't trust foreign doctors. Kitty, feeling lonely, writes a letter to Charlie, planning to have Waddington send it. But after learning about Charlie's unfaithfulness to his wife, Kitty tears up the letter in frustration. Back at home, Walter throws himself into his work, and his relationship with Kitty remains cold, distant. Kitty demands more attention, but Walter doesn't care. One day, Kitty sees a man who died of cholera lying in the street, which horrifies her. Waddington explains that almost everyone in the village has lost family members to the disease, leaving Kitty deeply shaken. She can't understand why Walter brought her to such a terrible place. Meanwhile, Walter continues to work tirelessly at the hospital, where the situation is worse than he imagined. After a long, grueling day, Walter comes home drunk for the first time, unable to even stand. Kitty sees him in this state and realizes how much he's struggling too. One day, despite being really scared, Kitty decided to explore the city. As expected, a lot of locals were rude to her since she was a foreigner. She went with Waddington to visit an abbess who ran a hospital and an orphanage. The nun was excited to meet the wife of the brave doctor who was out there saving lives. The abbess gave Kitty a tour of the place. The orphanage was next to the hospital, and even though it was clear that poverty was everywhere, the nuns did their best to keep things clean and educate the kids. The abbess warned Kitty not to look too closely at the terrible things happening in the hospital. She also told her how Dr. Fane wasn't just helping the sick, but also looking after the children who had lost their parents. Kitty couldn't handle it all and stepped outside, lost in thought about the people her husband was giving hope to. That evening, she even took him dinner, but found him asleep at his desk, still immersed in his research. He was too absorbed to explain his work to her, and when Kitty mentioned that the nuns spoke highly of it, seemed like he didn't want to talk about it and just went to bed. He was too consumed by his work to think much about Kitty, and she felt useless, wanting to earn back his trust and stop being despised. The next day, Walter continued his research, taking water samples from a river near the cemetery. He didn't realize that Kitty had followed him, but instead of going to the hospital, she went to the orphanage. The abbess informed her that one of the nuns had died of cholera, and Kitty asked if she could help in any way. The abbess gave her the task of taking care of the babies, which was far harder than Kitty had expected. Walter's water analysis revealed that the river was contaminated, so he immediately ordered the military to act. Meanwhile, Kitty struggled but persisted in helping the nuns. Walter was shocked when he saw her there. The villagers, however, were upset about his order to move the cemetery, believing their ancestors' souls should stay by the river. That evening, Walter warned Kitty it wasn't safe for her to wander around, but she didn't take his concerns seriously. Soon, Walter arranged for a mill to be built that would supply fresh water, solving a huge problem. Gradually, he became more connected to the village, sincerely wanting to end the cholera outbreak. During a campfire conversation, Colonel Yu pointed out that the British meddling in China's affairs was why the locals distrusted outsiders. Walter, however, insisted that his work was only to help, not harm. Walter addressed the local authorities, proposing his plan to relocate the cemetery and bring water to the village. They refused, saying if people died from cholera, it was fake. Colonel Yu intervened, making it clear that the military would support Walter, forcing the authorities to concede. One day, Walter overheard Kitty playing the piano for the orphans, and for the first time in a long while, he realized she had a kind heart. He started remembering the early days of their relationship and, for a moment, felt like he was falling in love with. Later that evening, Kitty told him how much she admired the nuns and his work. It surprised Walter, leading him to question his narrow view. He had always wanted Kitty to be perfect, but maybe it was time to accept her for who she really was. Tensions in the village remained high, and protests broke out as people resisted the changes. At one point, Kitty found herself surrounded by an angry crowd, but Walter arrived just in time, and they both narrowly escaped thanks to Sung Ching, who had a gun to calm things down. Back home, Kitty and Walter shared drinks with Waddington, who told them stories about his Chinese companion. The couple grew closer that night, with Walter seeing Kitty in a new light. But dangers still loomed. Kitty started feeling ill and eventually fainted. When she woke up, the nuns told her she was probably pregnant. She wasn't thrilled and confessed this to Walter, even admitting there was a chance the baby might not be his. However, Walter didn't care anymore. He was ready to accept the child, and the couple embraced. The village was now fully supplied with clean water, and while there was reason to celebrate, it was short-lived. Walter noticed a group of people coming from a nearby village that had been abandoned due to the epidemic. He tried to stop them from entering, knowing they'd infect the others, but no one listened, and chaos ensued. Kitty, meanwhile, was comforting the orphans as gunshots rang out in the distance. As things spiraled, Walter's health began to deteriorate, and soon, Kitty was informed that he had fallen ill. She rushed to be by his side, refusing to leave even when he told her to go for her own safety. Kitty stayed with him until the very end. Despite her efforts, Walter passed away, leaving Kitty emotionally exhausted. His funeral took place immediately, just as he had wished. Several years later, Kitty, now living in London with her young son, ran into Charlie. She had no desire to rekindle any connection, and when her son asked who Charlie was, Kitty simply said, "He's no one."